Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going behind the scenes of something you probably don't think about too much. Abu Dhabi's water and electricity sector.
We're going deep into some regulatory documents. It's going to have a fascinating look at how these essential services are managed.
We're talking about things like how prices are set, how investments are made, and what's being done to ensure those services are reliable and sustainable for the long haul.
We've got a stack of key documents here.
Okay, lay it on us. What are we working with?
First up, we've got the second consultation paper from October 2012.
2012. Okay, so this is going back a bit.
It is. Then we've got the draft proposals released in May 2013, and finally the final proposals from November 2013.
So a year-long process culminating in those final proposals.
Exactly, and all of these documents revolve around something called PC5, which stands for Price Control 5.
PC5. Okay, so right off the bat, we're talking about price controls. What's the significance of that in the water and electricity sector?
It's kind of like a big puzzle where all the pieces need to fit together.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Walk me through it.
PC5 sets the prices you pay for water and electricity, and it also sets performance targets for the companies providing those services. It's a multi-year review process that started even before 2012.
So we're not just looking at history. We're understanding decisions that shape the services people rely on today.
Exactly. Our goal in this deep dive is to understand how those prices are set, how companies manage those massive investments, and what incentives are in place to encourage them to perform better.
So where do we even begin with all of this?
To understand PC5, we need to start with the key players. In Abu Dhabi, you've got the Regulation and Supervision Bureau.
Often called the Bureau, right?
Right. They act as a kind of referee, ensuring fairness in the sector.
So they set the rules of the game.
In a way, but it's not a solo act. Abu Dhabi's government also plays a big role through ADWEA.
That's the Abu Dhabi Water and Electricity Authority.
Right.
So it's not just the Bureau calling all the shots.
Not quite. The documents show a real push to align government strategy with the price control process.
That makes sense. Governments have a vested interest in making sure essential services are affordable and meet the needs of the population.
Absolutely. And it raises an interesting question. How do political goals influence utility regulation?
I can see how that could get tricky, balancing the needs of consumers with the long-term goals of the government.
It's a delicate balance for sure. Now, going back to PC5, remember, it's a long process, years of planning before you see the tangible results.
It sounds like those massive infrastructure projects you see around the world.
It is, and they even brought in a team of external consultants to help with the technical aspects.
Oh, wow. So they really brought in the big guns.
You could say that you've got Deloitte tackling operating expenses,
Makes sense. They're the finance experts.
Kima and Apkins handling capital expenditure.
So the engineering and construction side of things.
And even E.C. Harris to value assets, especially in those huge mega developments popping up around Abu Dhabi.
It sounds like they assembled an all-star team. So with all these players involved, were there any major disagreements or controversies during this PC5 process?
Oh, absolutely. There were debates about whether certain costs should be passed on directly to consumers.
Okay, so give me an example. What kind of costs are we talking about?
One hot topic was amortization, those government programs that encourage companies to hire UAE nationals.
Interesting. So the question is, should the cost of those programs be shouldered by the utility companies or passed on to the people paying their utility bills?
Exactly. And there were strong arguments on both sides.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a tough one to navigate.
Another big point of contention was how to review capital expenditure.
Or CapEx, as it's often called.
Right. Basically, it's the investments companies make in things like power plants, water treatment facilities, grid upgrades, the big stuff.
So we're talking billions of dirhams being invested. Not small change.
You got it. Historically, the focus had been on looking back and assessing whether those investments had been made efficiently. But with PC5, there was a shift towards being more involved in the planning process.
So instead of just saying, okay, show us what you spent the money on, they're saying, let's work together to make sure these investments are smart and strategic.
Exactly. They wanted to scrutinize those plans before giving the green light.
I could see how that would make some companies nervous. It's like the bureau's looking over their shoulder, second-guessing their every move.
There were definitely concerns about regulatory overreach.
Some would argue that companies are in a better position to make those investment decisions.
Right, but the Bureau argued that they needed more oversight to protect consumers from unnecessary cost increases.
So it's about striking that balance, giving companies the freedom to operate, but also ensuring they're making responsible decisions with all those billions.
It's a delicate balancing act, for sure. And it wasn't just about costs, it was also about performance.
How so?
The Bureau was exploring ways to incentivize companies to improve their services, things like customer service, network reliability, even promoting efficient use of water and electricity.
So they're trying to make sure those investments translate into tangible benefits for the people using those services every day.
Precisely. And they weren't just tweaking existing systems, there were even discussions about potentially restructuring the entire industry.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. Backup restructuring, you mean like breaking up the companies?
Well, there were debates about whether to separate the supply and distribution aspects of the businesses.
So instead of having one company handling both the generation and the delivery of electricity or water, you'd split it into two separate entities.
Exactly. It's a trend you see in utilities around the world. Some argue it creates more transparency and competition, which can lead to lower prices.
But I imagine it also adds a whole layer of complexity.
It does, and some worry it could actually increase costs in the short term.
So it's a complex issue with potential pros and cons. I'm starting to see why this PC5 process was so challenging. It wasn't just dealing with numbers. It was about these big, fundamental questions about how to structure the entire industry.
And how to balance all those competing interests. Remember, these decisions have real-world consequences for everyone in Abu Dhabi.
It's fascinating how something decided back in 2013 can still be impacting our lives today.
That's the power of regulation. It sets the framework for an entire industry.
So let's talk about those numbers. We know billions of dirhams are being invested. What does that mean for people's wallets? Are we talking about major price hikes?
Well, the final proposal projects total operating expenses to rise from AED 3.3 billion in 2014 to AED 3.5 billion over the PC5 period.
Okay, but is that a lot?
Well, we need to remember these are 2014 prices, so we need to factor in inflation and other variables.
Right, it gives us a snapshot in time but doesn't tell the whole story.
Exactly, but what we can say is that costs were projected to rise, and a massive AED 40 billion was earmarked for capital expenditure between 2014 and 2017.
Wow, that's a serious chunk of change. What exactly were those big investments going towards?
Think about it. Abu Dhabi is a rapidly growing city. More people means more demand for electricity and water.
So these investments were about keeping up with that growth.
Exactly. It's about building new power plants, upgrading water treatment facilities, expanding the electricity grid, all that requires capital.
So it's not just about keeping the lights on today, it's about building a system that can meet the needs of tomorrow.
Exactly. But it also raises questions about affordability. How will those costs be passed on?
Yeah, will it lead to higher bills down the line?
That's a valid concern. It's a tough balancing act, investing in the future without making things unaffordable for people today.
Okay, so how do they even manage all of this? Billions in investments, competing interests, the need to keep things affordable. It seems overwhelming.
That's where regulatory asset values, or RAVs, come into play.
RAVs. Okay, break that down for me.
It's about making sure companies are compensated for the value of their assets.
Makes sense. You don't want them to lose money.
But it's also about holding them accountable for how efficiently they manage those assets.
So no inflating costs and passing them on to consumers.
You got it. The RAV adjustments in these documents show a real commitment to scrutiny.
To make sure everyone's being treated fairly.
Right, but RAVs are just one piece of the puzzle. To understand the financial side, we need to look at how the Bureau actually sets prices and incentivizes companies.
Okay, so walk me through it. How does this price control system actually work?
It revolves around calculating something called the maximum allowed revenue, or MAR.
The maximum amount a company can earn.
Right. It takes into account operating expenses, capital expenditure, even the cost of capital itself.
Sounds complicated.
It is, but here's where it gets interesting. There's an element called the Q term.
The Q term, what's that all about?
Think of it as a reward or penalty system.
Based on?
How well a company performs against specific targets.
Okay, so if they meet their targets, they get rewarded. If they fall short, they get penalized.
Exactly. Keeps them on their toes.
Interesting. It's like a built-in accountability mechanism.
You could say that, and that's just one example of the incentives we see in this PC5 process.
So lots of moving parts, lots of complexities.
There are, and a lot of real-world consequences for everyone in Abu Dhabi.
Okay, well, let's keep digging. Let's see what else we can uncover about this PC5 process and how it shaped Abu Dhabi's utilities.
One thing that really stands out is the focus on water infrastructure.
Why was that such a big deal?
Well, the documents reveal a concern about timed water supply.
Timed water supply. What does that even mean?
Imagine only having access to water during certain hours.
Like a water curfew?
Exactly. Not exactly convenient.
No, not at all. Especially in a place like Abu Dhabi.
The Bureau wanted to move away from that. They recognize that reliable water service is essential.
Makes sense. It's a basic necessity.
And they wanted to incentivize companies to invest in the infrastructure needed to achieve that.
So it's not just about meeting the need for water, it's about a higher standard of service.
Exactly, one that benefits everyone.
It's easy to take those things for granted until you don't have them.
That's true. Now, another area they focused on was promoting efficient use of water and electricity.
Okay, so we're talking conservation.
right? They explored things like public education campaigns
Making people aware of the issue,
and innovative pricing structures.
to encourage people to use less,
Right, like those tiered pricing
where the
systems.
more you use, the more you pay.
Exactly. It discourages wasteful practices.
Clever. So they're using economics to promote conservation,
That's the idea. And it's not just about individuals, it's about businesses too.
encouraging them to reduce their footprint.
Exactly. Now remember those international standards we talked about, PS 55 and ISO 55000?
Vaguely refresh my memory.
Those are all about asset management, making sure companies are following best practices.
So it's a way of ensuring those billions of dirhams in investments are being managed properly.
Exactly. A well-managed asset is less likely to break down or cause problems.
So it's about efficiency, reliability.
And safety too. It all ties together.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got these standards, we've got incentives to conserve, and we've got the Bureau taking a more active role in investment decisions.
It's all part of the PC5 puzzle.
Right. Speaking of which, let's circle back to those financial incentives for a second. We talked about the Q term earlier.
Right, the reward or penalty system.
Can you remind me how that fits into the bigger picture?
It's a key part of that formula for calculating the maximum allowed revenue.
OIR, right.
Right. The Q term can either increase or decrease that revenue depending on performance.
So companies have a real financial incentive to meet those targets.
Absolutely. It's not just about ticking boxes, it's about real consequences.
Okay, so they're being judged on things like network reliability, customer service, conservation ethics.
All of that and more.
It sounds like they're really trying to create a system that rewards good performance and discourages complacency.
That's the goal. Now, one more thing I wanted to touch on is the Bureau's focus on the electricity sector.
Right, because Abu Dhabi needs a lot of power to keep everything running,
Exactly. They had to make sure they had enough generating capacity to meet that growing demand.
which is where those capital expenditure plans come in,
Right, building new power plants, upgrading the grid.
making sure the system can handle a load,
Exactly. And they brought in those outside consultants to help with all the technical aspects.
to make sure those investments were strategic and aligned with future needs.
It's about anticipating future demand and staying ahead of the curve.
It sounds like a lot of forecasting and planning.
It is. You can't just wait until the lights go out to start thinking about these things.
That's for sure. It's like that old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Exactly. It's much better to plan ahead than to deal with a crisis later on.
So they're trying to find that sweet spot where they have enough capacity but aren't overbuilding and wasting money.
It's all about balance, and these documents show us how they were approaching that challenge.
It's really fascinating to see how all these different pieces fit together.
It's a complex system, but it's a system that impacts everyone in Abu Dhabi.
It's a reminder that these aren't just abstract policies, they have real-world consequences.
And those consequences can be felt for years to come.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the big picture takeaways you think our listeners should remember?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that utility regulation is not just about numbers and technicalities.
It's about people, right?
Exactly. It's about ensuring that everyone has access to essential services that are reliable, affordable, and sustainable.
And those aren't always easy things to balance.
No, they're not. But these documents give us a glimpse into how the Bureau was trying to achieve that balance back in 2013.
And hopefully it inspires our listeners to think more critically about the services they rely on every day.
Exactly, because these are issues that affect all of us.
Well said. Now, before we sign off, I wanted to touch on one more detail that I found particularly interesting in these documents.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What caught your eye?
It's not a major policy shift or a groundbreaking technical innovation, but it really highlights the human element of these decisions.
Okay, now you've got me curious. Tell me more.
Remember when we talked about timed water supply?
Yes, the idea of only having access to water during certain hours.
It seems almost archaic, doesn't it?
It does. Hard to imagine living like that in this day and age.
Well, as I was reading through the second consultation paper, I came across a passage where they talk about the impact of timed water supply on people's lives.
Oh, interesting. What did they say?
They talk about how it disrupts daily routines, makes it difficult to run businesses, and creates a sense of uncertainty.
Right. It's not just an inconvenience, it's a real hardship.
Exactly. And I think it's easy to get caught up in the technical and financial aspects of this, but we can't forget that these decisions affect real people.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that we're not just dealing with numbers, we're dealing with people's lives.
And their well-being.
Exactly. And I think that's a good place to leave it for today.
It is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Abu Dhabi's water and electricity sector. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's always more to explore.
There is, so stay curious, keep asking questions, and we'll see you next time for another fascinating deep dive.
It's amazing how something as simple as turning on a tap or flicking a light switch can connect us to this whole world of regulations and decisions.
It really is, and those decisions have a lasting impact.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key things you think our listeners should take away from all of this?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that utility regulation is not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Right, what works in one place might not work in another.
Exactly. And even within Abu Dhabi, things are constantly changing. New technologies emerge, consumption patterns shift.
So the system needs to be flexible and adaptable.
It does, and that's something the Bureau seemed to recognize.
Yeah, I remember how much emphasis they placed on promoting efficient water and electricity use.
Absolutely. Conservation is key, especially in a desert environment.
They were looking at everything from public awareness campaigns to innovative pricing structures to encourage people to conserve.
It's about finding the right mix of incentives and policies to drive sustainable behavior.
And it's not just about individuals, it's about businesses too.
Right? Everyone has a role to play.
Now, another thing that really impressed me was the Bureau's commitment to transparency.
Oh, absolutely. They went above and beyond to engage with stakeholders and make the process as open as possible.
They held multiple rounds of consultations, they sought input from various groups, they published detailed reports explaining their reasoning.
They were really committed to making the process accessible and understandable.
Which is so important when you're dealing with essential services that affect everyone's lives.
Exactly. Transparency builds trust.
So what's the big picture message here? What do you hope our listeners will take away from this deep dive?
I think the key takeaway is that utility regulation is ultimately about people,
It's about ensuring that everyone has access to these essential services.
and that those services are reliable, affordable, and sustainable.
It's a complex challenge with no easy answers.
It is. But I think the Bureau was on the right track with their approach to PC5.
They were trying to create a system that was fair, transparent, and forward-looking.
And that's something we should all be striving for.
Well said. So to our listeners out there, we hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of the complexities of Abu Dhabi's water and electricity sector.
And perhaps inspired you to think more critically about the services you rely on every day.
Because these are issues that affect all of us.
They do. And we all have a role to play in shaping the future of our utilities.
So thank you for joining us on this journey.
And keep those minds curious.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive into a topic that matters.